Ba weep Granagh weep Nini Bon. Welcome back to Transformers AutoBook Club, a weekly podcast where myself, and usually a guest, read, discuss, and deep dive into one issue of Marvel's Transformers comics. This is another landmark episode today though, because actually neither of those things is happening. There's no guest this episode, it's just me and you. And there's no comic book issue this episode either. I know last week I said that this week we'd start Man of Iron, which would be our first UK story in this read-through. And as you might know, we're following the reading order in Skybound's Til All Are One compendiums, which is a new reading order that's never been laid out before. It tries to put everything in the most chronologically sensible order that's possible. So when I said that Man of Iron came next, I was mistaken. In my rush to find guests and write notes and record and everything else, I totally forgot that there are two shorter, non-comic issue stories that come here next in the reading order, which we need to read first before we move on to Man of Iron. So Man of Iron is coming, and the audio for parts 1 and 2 has already been recorded and edited. I was ready to start putting the video together on what was Friday night here in Japan when I realized that these two shorter stories come before Man of Iron, not after, which for some reason I mistakenly thought that they did. You might also have noticed that this episode is coming out on a Wednesday instead of Saturday. The reason for that being that I am in the middle of moving. I started this project and did the first 4 issues and then decided somewhere in the middle of that I was going to move apartments, and I'm lugging a suitcase full of my stuff across to my new apartment on a train every night after work. It's been exhausting, but that means that I won't have internet at my place for a while. I don't know how long, which is not a problem. I can still edit everything on my PC. And like I said, I already have the next comic issue parts ready, so that's no problem. But uploading it is going to be a problem because I don't have internet at the house. I'll have to do it at work, I think. So the time schedule is going to be a bit wonky for the foreseeable future, but hopefully I'll get internet put in my place sooner rather than later. It's the kind of thing that should be easy, but when I contacted the only company that I can use, because that's the one that owns the phone line that runs into my apartment building, they called me on a number that I cannot call. It's like a one-way only number, and they said they need to talk to me about it for an hour in Japanese. And my Japanese is not that good, and it's also not something I want to do, to ask a coworker to sit and do that for an hour with me. So I'm going to try my luck at going into the store and doing it myself. At least that way I won't be on the phone. If I need to translate something, I can try and use a translator somehow or look something up. I don't know. So it's lucky for me, I guess, that the next 2 episodes are going to be these shorter stories. And I'm going to fill up the back end of the episodes with some Transformers comic-related news and some other things that are kind of relevant to this. There are some figures I want to talk about. I think I might do that next episode, just because they're so insane and cool. And being someone who previously said they're not much of a toy guy and living here in Japan, I think those figures fit really well in this series. So I'll get onto those next time. So today's story is called State Games. It's a short text story, which was originally published in the Transformers 1986 annual. The short length of this one is why I decided to do this one solo. There's a lot less to discuss, and there are a few illustrations that come along with the text, but there's no comic art to look at. So I'm going to switch around the order in this episode too. I'm going to put the story at the front, and then after the story I'll talk about some other stuff that you might want to stick around for if you want to know some news stories about things that are related to Transformers and the Transformers comics in particular. So why State Games comes next in the Til All Are One reading order is anybody's guess. For the sake of time and my own sanity, I think it'll be better if I just read the comics and the stories in the order given. If I start trying to piece together the previous chronology and trying to keep track of every thread of the plot to understand the placement of things in this new order, I'll lose a lot of time for very granular information that very few people are really going to care about. So I'm going to just not do that. Okay? Okay. Let's jump into our first solo episode and our first Prose story, State Games. So obviously I can't just read the story word for word. I actually would enjoy doing a very short audiobook style thing, but I think just to steer clear of getting myself in any trouble, I can summarize what's going on and I can talk about it, but obviously I can't just read the text. Megatron, in quotation marks, is the opening to this story, which begins right in the middle of an action sequence. Immediately we're drawn in. What's going on, where we are, and who is shouting Megatron's name are all unclear. But quickly we get our answers. Sunstreaker is getting absolutely thrashed, taking heavy damage and leaking fluid from a, quote, rhythmic assault timed to the crowd's growing chant. I was really impressed by this actually. The first few sentences get us right into the action, set the scene while giving us a few questions, and then it starts to answer those questions immediately, but slowly, by expanding on things we know already, which just lead us to more questions. The prose is great, and not what I'd have expected from an annual at all. DC and Marvel have annual comics every year, which are usually standalone stories or often anthology issues. But in the UK, annuals are these thin, hardcover books which come out around Christmas. There are annuals every year for, I would say, probably every kid show that's even a little bit well known. It's an easy gift for a relative who doesn't really know about, I don't know, whatever, Thunderbirds, but happens to know that a kid that they're related to is into it. Usually they're very kid friendly, with pages with small amounts of text in big font, lots of pictures, usually some stuff like word searches or spot the difference pages and stuff, some colouring in there, some short stories. It's usually pretty light and fluffy, they're cheap. It's just a nice, easy gift to get for somebody, you know? So yeah, I didn't expect it to open on Megatron pummeling Sunstreaker so badly that he's leaking fluid and almost losing losing limbs in front of a baying crowd. Next, it reveals to us that we're in Tarn, which is Megatron's home turf, in a gladiatorial competition. And though Sunstreaker had expected a hard time for Megatron, fighting in front of his home crowd, something else feels wrong to him. The gladiatorial contests themselves are not unusual on Cybertron at this time, but they were meant to be a sporting test of ability, a chance for the combatants to show off their skills with an energy weapon, a shield, and to show their athleticism. Instead though, Megatron is fighting exceptionally hard, timing his strikes to the roaring of the crowd. Sunstreaker doesn't even have time to finish that thought though, because Megatron lodges his axe in his shoulder and uses it as leverage to throw Sunstreaker to the floor. He raises his axe and slowly advances on the prone Sunstreaker, and that first vignette ends there beautifully. It says, his pace slow and deliberate, his weapon shimmering in Cybertron's cool night air. Megatron, 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 implying that Megatron's attacks don't stop with simply downing Sunstreaker, but also not outright saying or confirming that. I thought that was a really nicely delivered bit of subtlety, that you know he's striking in time with the crowd, and you hear the crowd continue to chant, but it doesn't specifically point out to you that Megatron is going ham on Sunstreaker. Close enough by to hear the cheering crowd. Someone referred to as the Autobot Overlord wakes up. His circuits are freshly charged, and he deduces from the sound that he's hearing that he'll soon be giving an award to a winning gladiator. It says that he removes himself from a circuit-encrusted wall, so I guess some kind of charging station. The Overlord now needs to return and charge often, which is a sure sign of his age. I know the feeling, my phone can't make it to 6 o'clock without a midday charge anymore. He is the last in the line of Autobot rulers on Cybertron, and being the last weighs on his mind. In times past, his forefathers ruled over a planet-wide autocracy, but it had dissolved into several independent city-states because of disagreements over distribution of resources. And I know I don't need to remind you, but taking this step back and looking at things this way is something I do virtually every time I read something in this series so far, for one reason or another. This is a children's series, designed almost exclusively to sell toys, but we're getting brutal combat and then an explanation of the political climate of Cybertron. They used the word autocracy. Like, prior to reading these 80s comics, I read Shattered Glass, which was awesome, exciting, and brutal, and I thought that was an outlier. Like, I thought that's just the way that series went, and that's what made that series special. But it wasn't generally the Transformers vibe, I thought, because I've been watching the G1 show and all that kind of stuff. And then I read the Skybound comic, which started a few years ago, and again, awesome, exciting, and brutal. And part of that I thought was to do with the writer, Daniel Warren Johnson, whose previous series, maybe a year or so before Transformers, was called Do a Powerbomb, which was just him showcasing his love of wrestling. And that shone through so much in the Transformers comic that he wrote. And I also thought, because Daniel Warren Johnson grew up watching Transformers, he used his love for the series to write this new take on it for adults like him, who wanted more of something they loved as a child, but for an adult version of themselves. But from this story, and a few other things that I've read in the Marvel comic series, it's not a new thing. There have always been people who will look at this series and this plot, which could easily be, big robots hitting each other, but they're just able to give it so much more depth than they need to. Going back a bit further, and kind of still in my mind, when I think of Transformers, I think of the G1 cartoon show and the glorious movie. And nothing could ever knock the movie off its pedestal for me, I don't think. But even here, this early on, into my reading of these comics, I'm 4 issues into the American version, and this is our first Prose story. But still, these comics are becoming my Transformers. Do you know what I mean? It's replacing the G1 show in my mind as the thing that is the first thing that comes to my head when I think of Transformers. This is my version of Transformers. I really love this stuff. It's great. I'm continually surprised and delighted and impressed by all the things I've been reading. And yeah, I've laughed a lot, and I've been bowled over just as many times. This is doing so much more work than it needs to do, and so much more world building in 2 pages. And these are small paragraphs. These are not it's not a novel. It's doing so much more in these 2 pages than G1 did in entire seasons. This series just keeps surprising me, and I love that. But let's not get too far into the weeds. This is from an annual, and not a comic. And from, I think, a year or 2 after where we're currently at, comics-wise. So anyway, Cybertron used to have one absolute ruler. The Autobots got greedy for energy, and that caused fractures and splintering of a once unified planet. As usual, I have questions about the entire timeline of production of Transformers here, because the name Autobot fits perfectly with the idea of an autocracy. Was that intentional, or did they just make up a name that sounded cool, and then somebody came up with this lore and this meaning later? It's not unheard of to do that. Reading through the 60s Doctor Strange comics, Stan Lee talks about how they just made up all the spell names and all the phrases like, by the hoary hosts of Hoggoth, and really just worried about making the lore to back those things up later. There's a really nice and subtle line in Transformers 1 about the Autobot name actually coming from the word autonomous too. So who knows what the true intention was behind its origins. But anyway, the Autobot Overlord continues his pondering, thinking that conflict over resources was bound to happen, since Autobots are able to live for thousands of years and have still continued to create new Autobot life. Resources becoming scarce enough to result in an energy crisis was a matter of when, not if. Keeping in mind that in the show, the Decepticons' entire motivation is collecting energy. This is really taking that very simplified idea and expanding it and fleshing it out. The larger city-states were able to monopolize the resources, and Iacon became the strongest of those city-states, and instated a council of elders to distribute fuel not only to the citizens of Iacon, but to the smaller neighbouring areas. Some areas used their stockpiles of fuel to assemble armies instead, and the story gives us some super interesting lore about who the leaders of those areas were before the start of the planetary war on Cybertron. Shockwave was the ruler of the next largest city-state, which is called Tarn, which is where Megatron is from, according to the opening section. And that makes total sense to me, given how monstrously strong and gigantic Shockwave is, that he was actually a leader, while Megatron, at least while Shockwave was in the picture, wasn't. Starscream is also mentioned, labelled as not a leader but a figurehead to the dictators of a place named Voss, who also formed a large army for themselves. The Autobot overlord is interrupted in his thoughts by a large, cat-like transformer named Nightstalker, who I'd never heard of before. It says that Nightstalker is his bodyguard, along with Ravage, who I have heard of. Nightstalker notes that melancholy always seems to take hold of the overlords in the last few hundred years of their lives, but breezes onto lighter topics by asking how the games are going. The overlord says that they're not progressing well at all, and the competition he had designed to promote goodwill between city-states had, if anything, worsened the tensions between them, especially between Iacon and Tarn, the two biggest powers. Many people on Cybertron are openly expressing their opinion that Cybertron is approaching global warfare. The Overlord finally gets up and prepares himself for the award ceremony. And then we join Ravage, who has no particular interest in the gladiatorial combat, but the drama of the current match is piquing his interest. Megatron is fighting with a skill and determination that Ravage has not seen for hundreds of years, and not only that, his precise movements and manipulation of the crowd shows Ravage that he has a tactician's mind and a knack for leadership which has not been seen since the heyday of the Overlords. We switch to Sunstreaker's perspective, and the sound of the crowd fades away from his perception. All he can feel now is the grip of Megatron's hand on his neck. Megatron whispers to him that it's time this farce ended, but he's interrupted by a voice shouting, "That is enough!" Megatron turns to see Optimus Prime, who he yells at to say he's not going to accept any interference from him. Megatron drops Sunstreaker and runs to assault Prime, who wasn't expecting it, and finds himself on his back. Megatron's energy axe splits open his chest, and Megatron raises the axe once again, but stops himself when Prime raises his photon pistol to his head. Another voice tells both of them to stop the violence, and it turns out to be the thin, reedy voice of the Overlord this time. He's wearing his robes of office, but still appearing old and infirm to the gathered crowds. Remember in the first issue, Prime very, very briefly spoke to someone who seemed to be a monarch on Cybertron? That monarch could have been one of Iacon's Council of Elders, and watching G1 again made me think that maybe that was Alpha Trion, but maybe it was this guy. Or maybe that comic was just written and drawn before any of those characters were even conceived, and it was just someone in charge that they whipped up for the very short exchange that they had. Who knows? Prime stands and tries to explain the situation to the Overlord, who isn't interested in hearing whatever it is he has to say. He says the pair of them shame the games and themselves. Overlord says that the game's award ceremony will be postponed while they try to reconcile and repair friendly relations between Iacon and Tarn. Ravage rejoins Nightstalker in the Overlord's quarters, wondering if the Overlord is really so naive as to be unaware of Megatron's true nature, but concluding that either way it didn't particularly matter because he'll be dead soon anyway. Given that Transformers can be repaired, it's interesting to find here that they do seem to have some kind of finite lifespan and do die of old age at some point, though they can live for centuries if not longer. Ravage thinks to himself that what he just witnessed could be the start of a new chapter in the history of Cybertron. At the power plant in Tarn, most of the workforce are away watching the games. They might have stood a chance against the saboteurs who have descended upon it, heading for its main generator. A robot named Tornado lays a hand on the generator and says that he could easily destroy the entirety of Tarn, but instead he and his conspirators hide in the shadows, and he demands to know, from whom we don't yet know, why. The person he's talking to is marked with a small insignia that shows him as a commanding officer in the armed forces of Voss, the city-state for whose mysterious leaders Starscream is a figurehead. The officer snaps that they're doing it because that's what they've been told to do, and he begins planting the explosives they're going to use to destroy the generator. Their plan is to make the explosion appear to have been caused by Iaconians, therefore causing Tarn to retaliate against them, escalating the already bubbling tensions between the two, and possibly leading to a full-scale war. Then they'll wait for the two sides to wear themselves down against each other while maintaining neutrality. Then, when they're both weak, they'll clean up and conquer both Tarn and Iacon. That was their plan, until an Autobot worker discovers them and recognizes them immediately as members of Voss's athletic team. The engineer runs away, having seen the explosives, and radios a message to the security officer. But Tornado, who has wind generation abilities, lifts them up and smashes them into the generator, and they crumble to the floor. The saboteurs leave, while the apparently dead engineer's radio receives a message to respond and confirm the report of the interlopers. But a quarter of a cycle later, the power plant explodes into a gigantic inferno which lit up the entire night sky, and, it says, countless Autobots witnessed the sight with mounting apprehension. Next we join Emirate Zaran, heading into the Celestial Temple in Iacon, which houses the Council of Iacon, who have been deadlocked in talks since the declaration of war on Voss by Tarn. So that radio message was enough to blame Voss for the attack. An apparent fellow council member, Tomandi, asks how the war is progressing, and Zaron explains that though there's supposedly a war, Voss's defenses have rarely been breached, and troops from Tarn and Voss seem to cross the borders indiscriminately. Iacon is also being flooded with refugees from both cities, and they're being housed in various places throughout Iacon and taken care of. Zaron urges another council member, I don't know how to say this name, Trachon, 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 to send a peacekeeping force to the war zone. But Trachon is having none of it, and he yells no at the suggestion. Trachon refuses to let any Iaconians get involved in the conflict, and besides, perhaps it's to Iacon's benefit that these two sides wipe each other out. Next, we join Megatron, who's gazing out at the wasteland that was once Tarn, thinking on his next move, going to Iacon and eventually remodeling it into a mobile battle station with which to conquer the entire galaxy, which fits with Megatron in issue 1, wanting to use the entire of Cybertron as a dreadnought. Megatron just seems to have a thing for scale, and honestly, I'm with him on that. There's just something cool about having a ridiculously oversized ship. Ravage approaches him, asking if he finds their current situation amusing, which Megatron says he does. He says that he finds it amusing in the extreme, and then what exactly that situation is explained to us. Prime has been tasked with escorting the Autobot Overlord back to Iacon, which is where Megatron wants to head anyway, and so he offers to join that convoy. Tarn's power station has been destroyed, therefore disrupting any means of travel besides going on foot. So Prime and the Overlord and Megatron have a long journey ahead of them and will have to pass through the combat zones created by the newly sparked war. They've almost made it to Iacon at this point, though they've had to stop frequently for the Overlord to recharge and to fight off attacks from shock troops. They have one more expressway to cross, and then they'll be safe inside Iacon. The Overlord is laying down and charging near a disused Tarn border fortress, and Prime is doing what he can to help the aging Autobot, who Megatron is sure is getting closer and closer to death. With the two of them indisposed for the moment, Megatron slowly and carefully walks through the Autobot corpses laying scattered on the expressway, seemingly trying to get to Iacon alone and before the others. But a piece of the expressway crumbles and he falls through, feeling a pain in his right arm before he loses consciousness. The following section opens with Megatron regaining consciousness and Prime commenting that it was lucky that he was able to stop Megatron's fall, because they'll need all the help they can get to find an alternative route to Iacon now that the expressway has collapsed. So it sounds like Megatron started to fall, got caught, but passed out all the same? I don't know. Let's just say he smacked his head really hard. But does that even make it make much more sense given that he's a robot? He passed out. For whatever reason, he passed out. Nightstalker approaches and says that finding another route won't be possible now. The Autobot Overlord won't survive being moved anymore. Prime suggests that Megatron, Nightstalker, and Ravage stay with the Overlord while he goes ahead to Iacon to bring back help. But Nightstalker protests and says that would take days, and the Overlord needs medical help now. Prime, now in the mindset that he's going to go it alone, realizes that if he does that, they won't need to find another route into Iacon, so he can just take a shorter way there. He leaps over the hole in the expressway and he's gone. Nightstalker reflects on the quiet calm of Tarn, which used to be a bustling and noisy city, and how it mirrors the Overlord's deteriorating condition. They head over to where the Overlord is laying, but see the glare of a fired electron pistol in the darkness, and almost simultaneously, his missile launcher is melted. Tarn shock troops run towards Nightstalker, and Megatron yells, "Down!" And there's a huge explosion. When the dust settles, Nightstalker sees Megatron, a fusion cannon taken from one of the downed warriors on the expressway strapped to his arm. Megatron yells that the shock troops will soon regroup and attack again. Soon the group is backed up against the collapsed expressway, which it seems none of them can clear at a leap like Prime did, and the advancing shock troops. Megatron calls to Nightstalker and says that their only way out of this now is to bridge the gap in the expressway. But Nightstalker, loyal bodyguard to the Overlord, jumps right into the midst of the oncoming shock troops and yells back that Megatron can't abandon the Overlord like this. The shock troops relentlessly beat Nightstalker, but suddenly there's another huge explosion, and all of the shock troops are destroyed. Megatron questions what happened, and Ravage explains that the Overlord's bodyguards are fitted with bombs as a final defense, so it seems that Nightstalker intentionally jumped into the crowd and self-destructed in order to protect the Overlord, who now manages to speak and says, "Help, please." Megatron walks over to him, and in what is the only part of this that I didn't find serious, and didn't read with my eyebrows furrowed, trying to keep all the details in order in my mind, Megatron hears a dying man asking for help, and he says, "Yes?" with a question mark. The Overlord asks for some of Megatron's energy to tide him over until Prime returns. But Megatron smiles and says, "No, old one, no energy for you," figuring that having the Overlord out of his way would be one less obstacle on the path to his plans, and he can easily just tell Prime that the stress of the shock troop attack killed the Overlord. The Overlord turns to Ravage, who snarls that he won't give up any energy either. Cybertron's balance of power is shifting, and Ravage has decided to ally with the future ruler of the planet. The final thing the Overlord sees before dying is Ravage walking away to join Megatron. Later, Megatron stands on a dais before a crowd of what it says are Autobots. The exact meaning of that feels a bit vague here. I think it feels like it just means Transformers, but I guess since there are no Decepticons yet, and the Overlords rule as an autocracy, it makes sense that just everybody would call themselves an Autobot at this point in time. Voss and Tarn had mysteriously both launched their photon missiles at the same time. Missiles that were meant to be an ultimate deterrent, so it seems like a mutually assured destruction thing. So both cities were totally leveled, and now the survivors of both cities are united in their hopelessness and anger. Megatron has also convinced the whole rabble that Iacon could have intervened to stop the mass destruction, but either failed to do so or chose not to. The crowd now believes that the war was intentionally started by Iacon to rid themselves of their powerful neighbors. Megatron declares that from this day forward, they will be known as the Decepticons, and when Iacon least expect it, they will have their revenge. And as he leaves the auditorium, in a beautiful bit of symmetry, Megatron hears the same sound as he did at the beginning of the story, a crowd rhythmically chanting, Megatron, Megatron, Megatron. And that's the end for our first non-comic story, but dang, what a good one. I've read some of the aligned continuity novels, and this is basically a much shorter version of some of those events. For how early on this is in the life of Transformers, I'm so impressed at the level of detail and world building in this short, and I think that many others must have been too, because you can see where other iterations of Transformers have followed in this vein. Transformers 1 had a big dollop of this flavor in it for me, I think. For this to have been in the pages of a kid's Christmas annual feels so funny to me as someone who got countless annuals as gifts from grandparents and uncles, and nothing I ever got was even close to as sophisticated as this. It's so clearly too complex for children too. I get the vibe that even at this time, adults must have been expected to be reading this, right? Like I said earlier, it's doing so much more work and delivering so much more than it needs to. That was great, and I really enjoyed that. If the future Prose stories can be even half as good as this, and even half as interesting, they're going to be awesome. So yeah, that's our first non-comic Prose story done. But before the end of the episode, there are a couple of other things I thought I should talk about. Number one is the Energon Universe and its potential upcoming animated series. In news confirmed by a whole bunch of places, including ComicsBeat, Deadline, and Bleeding Cool News, amongst others, the Energon Universe is currently in development as an animated series. I didn't see this coming at all, but the now current writer of Void Rivals and Transformers, Robert Kirkman, has had massive success with the adaptations of his comics, The Walking Dead and Invincible. And the Energon Universe comics are the highest-selling licensed IP ever published by Image Comics. So this makes a lot of sense, actually. Details are a bit scant at the moment, but it seems like it's going to be one series, not a bunch of interconnected series. And it does have an adult audience in mind, so while we're not getting the adult Transformers animated series that I'm sure is the dream for many of us, we are potentially getting a larger series that will include at least a bit of that. Development sounds super early on for now though, so it'll likely be years from now if this does happen. But it's super cool news nonetheless. For me personally, I would have preferred it if it were a separate series, just because there's some of the Energon Universe stuff that doesn't quite vibe with me, and to have a modern 2D animated adult-oriented Transformers based on the comic that I adore would have been so amazing. And who knows, it might be a long-running series that covers everything that happens in those comics, just in chronological order. I mean, there's no information. We don't know. So we might get all of those amazing stand-up moments from the comic animated. I cannot wait to see that. And the last thing I got to talk about is not so pleasant. It's about the Kickstarter, which is what sparked this entire thing for me. I'd been wanting to read the Transformers comics from the 80s forever, and they're really hard to get hold of, and this Kickstarter came along at just the right time for me to be able to get them and to read them for my first time. So I'm kind of biased in that I'm super hyped that there's just a way for me to get them in paper form at all. I think lots of the people who backed it on Kickstarter might have been long-term fans or longer-term fans than me and already have a copy, and so they were just getting a nice fancy pants version with this new reading order. So I think their perspective is a bit different. Mine is really just pleased to have a way to get hold of it, but a lot of people are really upset about some details that have come out. One of them is that they're using the Hachette IDW recolor, which we knew already, that's not news, but that recolor, as we have discovered in the first 4 issues already, contains a bunch of errors caused by the recoloring process. I don't know what they did. It must have been some kind of automated system, because it squashes and like transmogrifies some of the text, so some words are incorrect or like the spelling is funky, and it's not impossible to read. You can kind of figure out what it's meant to say, but for a very expensive set of books and for a Kickstarter that raised, $4+ million, people are a bit upset that hasn't been corrected, which I thought might have been the case. I thought they might have gone through and adjusted those errors, but it appears that it's really just a straight up reproduction of the Hachette stuff. The reason that's upsetting a lot of people is because that those scans are in places low quality. Like the pages that they used to scan in to make those earlier reprints are like creased and damaged, and like that's something that you could really fix. You know, like if you really, really, really wanted to go out of your way to make this the best it could possibly be, you could pay somebody to fix those for you, to reconstruct them digitally and then allow you to print them on paper or whatever. And they haven't done that, it appears, and there are an awful lot of very angry comments about that. Like I said, my perspective is a bit different because I'm just pleased to be able to read them. On the other hand, though, if it were me, yes, I'd want to go back and fix those for posterity. And just because this would then become the new standard, this would be like the most nicely presented it can possibly be for the time being, right? It just feels like that's a worthwhile thing to do for like archival reasons more than anything. So yeah, I think it's a bit of a shame that they didn't do that, but I'm not angry about it. Like I said, I'm just super pleased to be able to get these at all. And if this Kickstarter success means that we're able to get the IDW stuff later, like that's awesome too. I really, really want that to happen. I really want to read the other stuff that I've missed. And one final thing that's bothering people is that the UK issues have separate covers. And as you'll hear in the audio for the next comic issue, we noticed that as we were reading it actually, that I had one cover for the 2 parts of Man of Iron, and my guest Uneven Flow had 2. And that was a bit weird. I didn't think about it too much at the time because I know that these issues were published in a weird way where half of the American story was printed along with the UK stuff, and I wasn't sure what cover they would be using. But yeah, the UK issues had their own covers, and a lot of those are missing. They're not included in the collection anywhere at all, and that's upset a lot of people. Again, it doesn't bother me personally, but I can see for like, if you want this collection to be the perfect collection, you want it to have everything, and you want it to be like a preservation thing, like an archival thing, you know, where all these things are together and it's like definitive. Yeah, that's kind of a bummer that it's missing out some stuff. Again, personally, not too worried, but it's really upset some people who have gone off in the comments on the Kickstarter. Usually I'm the type of person to say that there's no positive outcome to being negative and angry. In this particular situation though, I can see where you would think you spent a lot of money, they have the time and the resources to do these very small, simple things that really would just tie all this up neatly in a bow. And like I said, people's perspective is going to be different depending on if they have these comics already or not. If you already own these, having them just reprinted in a bigger book and reordered a bit does seem to be a very small upgrade, I guess. But if you're like me and you just haven't been able to get hold of these, yeah, this is great. I'm still so excited. So I just thought I'd comment a little bit on the hubbub there for those who don't know about it. And I think these compendium sets are going to be available outside of the Kickstarter later, and I guess it is useful to know that these issues exist for those who are on the fence about picking those up. So do with that information what you will. I'm still so excited. I'm going to get mine the beginning of next year at some point, and I'm sure once they come I'll make a very excited video about opening them, though I'm sure there'll be dozens by then because they're going out to everyone else who lives in America before that, the end of this year. So I can't wait to see those. I'm excited to see what they look like for real. But until then, I'll keep reading the PDFs that Skybound sent out to us. Speaking of those PDFs, I'll be using that for our next episode, which will come out again. I think this one is going to be out on a Wednesday. Give myself another week to get one done. In between the moving process seems sensible, though it will not be the Man of Iron story. That's going to come the week after that. So next week's episode is going to be looking at a very short comic story which comes next in the reading order after State Games. It's called And There Shall Come, ellipses, a leader, exclamation point. And there shall come a leader. So that's all from me for this week. As always, here comes the least pleasant part of making these episodes. If you're enjoying the show, please do leave a comment, subscribe, like, share it to your nerdy friends, leave me a review on your podcast platform of choice if you're listening to the audio version, and don't forget to join the Discord too if you want to hang out and talk about giant robots. I was a bit downhearted after episode 3. The numbers seemed really low and I just felt like, oh man, I made this thing that took me hours and hours and nobody saw it. And then after episode 4, for some reason, a few new people subscribed, a bunch of people commented, and I felt so galvanized by that. I felt really pleased that even a few people had really enjoyed what I was making, and that felt like, yeah, I do want to continue doing this. It does take a lot of time and effort, but I do genuinely enjoy it, and listening back to the audio recordings when editing is really fun. Like, I think this is a fun show, to be honest with you, and I want to keep making it. So yeah, it would be really helpful and mean a lot to me if you could help other people to find it, so that if the audience gets big enough, there are opportunities to do other things in the future. I've got some plans of things I would love to do if I can. As always, thank you so much to you for listening. I really love this project and I really love this series, and it's been so much fun to read these. But until next time, until we run into each other again, take care, be kind, and do good. Till All Are One.